Hello everyone, Just Podcast TV is here. Please don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notified on new contents.
James took his phone from his pocket and glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number calling. He was about to answer when he saw the other drivers climbing out of the Ferrari and Lamborghini. James noticed that they were both wearing masks. The Lamborghini driver shouted to James, "Hey man, you're awesome." At the same time, the Ferrari driver gave James an enthusiastic thumbs up. Then the man ran from their cars and rushed towards the bridge. Without hesitation, they both jumped into the River Thames below. The sirens were growing louder, coming closer. Whatever the men were up to, they obviously knew what they were doing, which included abandoning their cars. Despite being a billionaire himself, James was amazed that the men would intentionally leave behind such expensive vehicles. He finally answered the call on his ringing phone. From the other end of the line, the strange voice from earlier spoke again. "If you don't pick up the phone, you'll be surrounded by the police within the next 2 minutes. Oh, but lucky for you, you've picked up. I almost thought that I was going to lose you, a major player. But now you've earned yourself 2 precious minutes." James listened intently, but didn't respond. The man continued, "First of all, I have to congratulate you on successfully passing stage 1 of the game with superb results. We'll honor our promise to guarantee the safety of your friend. Because you've demonstrated superior racing skills, you've graduated to major player status and qualified to move on to the second stage of the game. Now you have exactly 1 minute and 30 seconds to climb to the top of Tower Bridge and evade the police. After completing this task, I'll call you back with instructions for entering stage 2. Major player, I can already hear the sirens approaching. Go, good luck." The line went dead, and James shoved the phone back into his pocket. He hadn't said a word throughout the entire conversation. He'd been too busy listening to the instructions and scouting out how to climb to the top of Tower Bridge. The tower closest to James was extremely tall. It didn't matter. For James, climbing up wouldn't be difficult at all, and he would be fast. Moving quickly, he approached the tower. When he was still several yards away, he got a running start and then jumped. He latched onto an iron railing and nimbly swung himself up and over onto a small balcony on the second story of the tower. He moved like a cat in the night, climbing swiftly and silently. It took James less than 30 seconds to climb to the top of the tower. James thought that it was a shame that nobody had witnessed his elegant climb. Only the starry sky over London had observed the scene. Even the vampire man in the abandoned factory had missed seeing it. There were no cameras along the path James had climbed up the side of the tower. James sat at the top of the tower, surrounded by the midnight breeze and enjoying the mesmerizing view of London below. It was then that the police cars arrived at Tower Bridge. Just as the man on the phone had said, the race through the city streets had attracted the attention of the police. Watching the officers pull up and pour out of their vehicles, he figured there must be 100 of them. James's phone rang again, and he quickly answered to silence the ringtone. The now familiar voice said, "Congratulations, you've completed the mission. We've officially entered stage 2, escape from Tower Bridge. On the eastern slope of the roof of the tower, there's a window. Just inside that window, you'll find a mini parachute. Put it on, then jump from the tower roof to the bridge below. The police officers won't be able to see you from where they are positioned facing the west side of the tower. On the bridge, 2 challengers are waiting to fight you. If you look down at the bridge platform now, you should be able to see them waving to you." James climbed to the east side of the roof, and he looked down. Yup, there they were, 2 guys in masks, waving at him in the dark. James noticed that both men were already wearing parachutes on their backs and looked ready to jump at any time. These people weren't messing around. They'd even factored in the police presence in their calculations. In fact, they'd intentionally lured the police here to unwittingly play a supporting role in the game. It was all part of the grand design. James had to admit that his opponents were not only bold, they were extremely intelligent. After pausing for a moment to allow James time to look, the voice on the other end of the phone continued. There are 3 speedboats waiting under the bridge. There's a map on each boat. As long as you arrive first at the dock marked on the map, you'll successfully complete stage 2. The man added, of course, if you lose this time, you'll receive 2 of your friend's beautiful fingers. So good luck, my major player. Based on your performance in stage 1, I believe in you. James found the open window and fished out the parachute backpack hanging on a hook inside. Stage 2 begins when I get to number 1, the man said. The countdown began without warning. James cursed the man 1,000 times over. 3. James shouted, hold on, I don't even have my chute on. 2. It felt useless to argue now. James had already estimated that from where he stood on the roof of the tower, the surface of the river below was roughly 200 feet. In the shape he was in, he didn't expect a jump that far to be a problem for him. So before the man reached the end of the countdown, James ran 3 steps towards the edge of the roof and leapt off the tower into the sky, falling straight down toward the dark river below. In midair, James heard the word 1 come from the phone, and then he stuffed the phone deep inside his pocket. The 2 men on the bridge were shocked to see James jump off the tower without a chute. They watched him free-falling in utter disbelief, muttering, what the hell? They'd momentarily forgotten what they were there for in the first place. They needed to get moving. A police officer on the far side of the bridge noticed James falling through the air and cried out, whoa! Someone jumped off the tower! That jolted the 2 men on the bridge into action. They both ran to the side of the bridge. Without even looking down first, they climbed over the railing and jumped toward the river below. An officer shouted, look, someone else jumped in. What are they doing? Suicide? Asked another officer. A police captain ran up and commanded, quick, 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 get the lifeboat. The officers quickly got moving. None of the officers had pulled out their guns. The situation didn't seem to warrant it. But when they saw the person who just jumped from the bridge deploy a parachute, the mood instantly changed. The officers immediately concluded that this wasn't suicide, it was murder. Someone had forced another person to jump off the bridge. In a flash, all of their guns were drawn. James plunged into the water, straight as a stick. The water pressure hit his eardrums in an instant, sounding like thunder exploding in his ears. He continued deeper for 20 feet before finally bobbing to a stop. His skin felt chafed where he'd hit the water. The first thing he did was check his arms and legs for brakes. Because he'd entered the water in the correct position, his body was unharmed. Only after checking himself over did he start swimming up towards the surface. In the abandoned factory, the man in the vampire mask and his companions watched everything that had transpired on the bridge in astonishment. After their initial surprise at the unexpected turn of events, everyone grew so excited that they started dancing and shouting. Awesome! Unbelievable! A remarkable player! Still strapped to the chair on the far side of the room, Cindy heard the group placing a new round of bets. This time, their wagers were much higher. Cindy felt even more tormented. James had successfully passed the first level, but the difficulty of the game would only increase. If he continued playing, she was afraid that something terrible would happen to him, sooner or later. Tied up as she was, there was nothing she could do to stop it. The cruel reality was that all she could do was watch helplessly as the game played out. And suddenly she understood. It was as if the kidnappers were enjoying watching their loved ones die, one by one. It was another sick, twisted thrill for this gang, who wore monster masks and had the hearts of beasts. Under Tower Bridge, James broke the surface of the water. He looked up to see that the scene on the bridge had turned into complete chaos. Life rings had already been tossed down from the bridge to the water. It looked as though several police officers were gearing up to come into the water to rescue him. His 2 opponents, who jumped off the bridge after him, drifted down to the river wearing their chutes. Suddenly, a voice rang out from the darkness beneath the bridge. Hey, over here! James turned to see that beneath the bridge, 3 speedboats were parked and bobbing gently in the water. Standing in one of the boats, a man wearing a wetsuit was waving at James. The man didn't say anything else, likely because he didn't want to attract any police attention. Instead, he pointed at one of the speedboats, then dove into the water and disappeared. James estimated that he was only 30 feet away from the speedboat, with his opponents a bit farther away, perhaps 40 or 45 feet. None of them wasted any time and started swimming toward whichever boat was parked closest. James had never had any formal training, but he'd been swimming in the river in his hometown since he was young, and he was a strong swimmer. He torpedoed through the water with ease. The other two men, while fast swimmers, couldn't close the gap between them. James had nearly reached his boat when he heard loud splashes exploding all around him. He turned to see that a police officer had jumped into the water on an apparent rescue mission. When the officer came to the surface and saw James, who by then had reached the boat, the officer shouted, "Sir, don't be afraid. We're the police. Stay there and don't move. We've come for you." James couldn't spare a single moment explaining things to the officer. Wasting time could cost Cindy her fingers, if not her life. While the dumbfounded police officer watched, James effortlessly hoisted himself into the boat. He immediately spotted the map on the driver's seat. James had a photographic memory. With just one look at the map, he was able to carve the details into his mind. Like with the Audi, the key was waiting for him in the boat's ignition. James turned the key, put the boat into gear, and tore off at top speed down the River Thames. As James sped past the officer in the water, he shouted, "Thank you for coming to my rescue." Everything had happened so fast that all the officer could do was watch James drive away. It was mesmerizing. The officer felt as though he were watching a dynamic leading man in an action movie. James's challengers arrived at their boats, climbed in, and left just as quickly down the river. The boat sent waves spreading out across the water. In the starlight, the speedboats appeared to be three enormous sleek fish gliding swiftly along the surface. In their wake, the boats left behind dozens of police officers feeling restless and milling about Tower Bridge. Remembering the map, James knew exactly where he was going: Canary Pier, the final destination for stage 2 of the game. James floored the accelerator, and the boat seemed to be flying across the water. The sense of speed coupled with the boat bouncing against the waves made James feel as if he were driving an all-terrain vehicle along a rocky road. It was hard to reconcile that the softest thing in the world, water, could create such a collision. A deafening sound exploded right behind his flying speedboat. Immediately after that, James saw a huge wave heading straight for him. Caught totally off guard, his breath caught in his chest. James managed to keep his hand steady on the steering wheel and executed a 90-degree turn to avoid the terrifying wave. Just as James dodged the wave, the other two speedboats suddenly overtook him. Both drivers shouted excitedly at James from their boats. James yelled, "Seriously? You're throwing grenades?" James adjusted his direction again and rushed forward, chasing the other boats at high speed. But the two drivers ahead of James launched another round of grenades at him. If James caught up to them, a grenade might very well land and explode right inside his boat. James was furious. Of course, he hadn't been provided with any weapons in his boat. If they continued launching grenades, James would be forced to fall back, increasing the distance between them and decreasing the chances of him winning the second round. James yelled, "You consider this a fair game? Screw you!" They were a bunch of damn animals. Sinister, cunning bastards, James thought, as the fury in his heart burned ever more fiercely. James needed to suppress his anger and stay focused. No matter what, he had to keep playing the game. His goal was to save Cindy, not to fight and show off. He couldn't afford to lose this game. There was a human life at stake. And not just any human life, beautiful Cindy's life. He continued to chase after the boats ahead. The two drivers ahead were ruthless and kept tossing grenades at James behind them. Each time a grenade exploded, huge waves were sent crashing along the river. James wasn't giving up. He calmly observed and looked for opportunities. James closed the distance once again and quickly approached the other speedboats. As James pulled up alongside, one of the other drivers turned his head and smiled, before casually tossing another grenade right at James. "Here you go." James saw the grenade heading straight toward him. In an instant, he grabbed a fire extinguisher from beneath the dashboard of his boat. In one graceful and perfectly timed motion, James batted the grenade right back toward the other boat. The grenade drew a beautiful arc in the air before landing in the other speedboat and instantly exploding with an ear-splitting bang. The blinding burst of light from the explosion lit up the night sky like a deadly firework. The speedboat was blown apart and shrapnel flew in every direction, producing whistling sounds in the air and lighting up the sky like fireflies. The driver of that boat didn't even have time to be frightened. What was left of the speedboat was upended by the enormous wave created by the explosion. Then the boat slammed back down and quickly sank below the surface of the river. Amid the chaos, it was impossible for James to tell whether the masked man on the speedboat was dead or alive. Right after batting the grenade back into the other boat, James had quickly steered to the left to avoid the explosion. Then he'd crouched down as low as possible. James heard bullets whizzing past his head, being shot from an unknown direction. Bullets hit the fiberglass body of his boat with alarming bangs. Only when the shots were silenced did James stand up from the bottom of the boat. He retook control of the wheel and continued chasing the remaining speedboat ahead. The driver of the boat felt anxious and excited. He'd watched James finish off his partner by reversing the direction of the grenade. Then James had dodged the shrapnel and quickly regained control of his own boat. Now, James was quickly catching up to him. James could sense that despite his opponent maintaining the lead, he was growing nervous, because it appeared to only be a matter of time before James caught up with him and dealt with him too. The other driver realized that even though he was seeking excitement, the scene of his partner being blown up by a grenade was too exciting. His heart beat wildly, and he was unable to calm down. Wasn't it true that for members of the Black Bat Society, their thrill-seeking would never truly cost them their lives? After all, they were the players who controlled the game. Only now, was that still the case? The man thought, this is no longer just a game. People are going to get killed. The man felt under such pressure from James quickly gaining on him that he pounded the steering wheel of the speedboat with both hands. He wished he could fly away in the boat like a plane. The man gaining on him suddenly seemed like more than a player. He seemed like an angel of death. "Go back to hell," he shouted angrily at James behind him, "or I'll blast you there myself." This man wasn't certain whether he'd regained his confidence or lost his mind. He started indiscriminately tossing grenades behind his boat. His aim was terrible, but James didn't even need to change course to avoid them. The man realized then that obviously he'd lost all confidence and felt scared out of his mind. With his opponent displaying such miscalculations, James knew that he didn't need to worry about him. With his superior boating skills, James could easily surpass him and win the round. When James was close to the other boat, he fashioned a lasso out of the end of a nylon rope he'd found tucked into the compartment next to the steering wheel. James swung the rope above his head, trying to calculate the right time to toss it. The two speedboats were traveling at roughly 60 miles per hour. Clearly, lassoing this man was going to be much more difficult than lassoing a horse on dry land. James had to simultaneously calculate wind speed, friction, angles, and the strength of the rope. If James failed to consider even one of these elements, he'd fail, and there'd be no second chance. But this was James. He tossed the rope and it sailed gracefully through the air before landing perfectly above the man's head, and then falling just below his shoulders. James tugged hard, and the lasso trapped the man's arms inside the rope. The man screamed in fear and tried to pull off the rope that seemed to have come out of thin air, but it was too late. The moment the rope was securely wrapped around the man's arms, James took his foot off the accelerator and his boat began to slow. The other speedboat didn't slow down, not one bit. The variation in speeds caused the rope to tighten even further. It all happened so fast that the other driver didn't have time to utter a sound before his entire body was yanked off his boat. The out-of-control speedboat immediately crashed against a row of pilings at high speed. After impact, a ball of fire shot up into the sky. James's expression turned cold. Continued to drive his speedboat forward. He defeated his opponents. The road ahead was smooth. Soon, he'd arrive at Canary Pier. No sooner had James stepped onto the boardwalk of Canary Pier than his phone rang again. As usual, it was an unknown number. James was completely surprised, not by the other party calling, but by the fact that his phone was still working despite getting soaked when he jumped from Tower Bridge into the River Thames. The call he'd expected, since the game wasn't over yet. The phone still working was unexpected. This was the phone that Mitchell had helped James get, and evidently was waterproof. James picked up the call but didn't say a word. All anyone on the other end of the line would have heard was the wind whistling across the pier. From the opposite end of the phone, James heard a wave of applause and cheers. Then there was laughter, followed by a voice saying, "Bravo, bravo, bravo!" Judging by the degree of excitement, they clearly weren't angry that James had gone to shocking lengths to take out two of their companions in the second round. Instead, they seemed to be even more excited by James's performance. In a word, it was madness. Genuine madness. It was apparent to James that their only concern was whether the game was exciting enough. As for the fate of their companions, they didn't seem to care. The voice continued, "Congratulations on passing the second stage. I like you more and more. Amazing player. I must say this is the most exciting round I've ever seen." James coldly replied, "Just wait. You haven't seen anything yet." James's threat made the man in the vampire mask shiver. This was outrageous. The man quickly regained his composure and continued speaking. "Is that so? Then I look forward to your next performance." After all, his opponent still had 3 more stages to pass. And even if James prevailed in all 3 stages, the man in the mask was still holding a trump card in his hand. In fact, regardless of how well James played the game, he wouldn't live to see the sun come up tomorrow morning. To the masked man, life was nothing. The man instructed James, "Keep walking forward. At the end of the pier, you'll see a motocross motorcycle. You'll also find a map with the route and rules for the 3rd stage. Major player, I look forward to seeing how you do next." There was a slight pause before the man added, "I must warn you that if you lose this stage, I'll give you the beautiful arm of your friend." The line immediately went dead. James put his phone back in his pocket. In the dark of night, he once again moved like a cat, swiftly running between the shadows of the containers stacked along the dock. Right when he walked off the pier, he saw to one side a row of motocross motorcycles silently parked. There was a map affixed to the handlebars of one of the motorcycles. James took it off the handlebars and scanned it. As before, there was a red line marked on the map. The route was obviously not a main street. It looked to be an unpaved country road that eventually turned into a pedestrian pathway. At the end of the route, there appeared to be a large abandoned-looking structure. Below the map, written in red ink, were the rules of Stage 3. After studying the map and memorizing the details, James tossed it into the trash bin by the roadside. With his memory, the map was already engraved in his mind. The rules of this competition seemed clear. The first across the finish line would be the winner. "Sure, you'll play fairly," James fiercely waved his fist. He'd never believe these people's nonsense again. It seemed to James that for them it wasn't about being fair. There was only the pursuit of excitement, and there seemed to be no limits as to what they were willing to do to find it. James put on the helmet dangling from one end of the handlebars, climbed onto the bike, and started the engine. Every fiber of his being was tense. The rules of the game had described the 3rd level as difficult, so James knew that the journey up to Ghost Mountain would be challenging. There were grenades in the 2nd round. What would they pull on him in the 3rd round? James hopped on the motorcycle and rode to the end of the road, where he found 2 new opponents waiting for him. At the end of the road, James was suddenly under gunfire. The bullets whistled through the night sky, leaving streaks of light in the darkness. The shots seemed to be coming from the dense forest beside the road. James was prepared. He snapped off the headlights in an instant and squeezed the front brakes. Then, using one foot on the ground, he pivoted the motorcycle into a 90-degree turn and came to a stop. "Stop shooting!" James yelled toward the forest. A bullet whizzed past his ear and lodged into a tree right behind him. "Damn it, this isn't fair," James muttered bitterly to himself. Suddenly, James heard maniacal laughter up ahead. "This is so awesome," a laughing man said. The lights of 5 motorcycles flipped on all at once, illuminating the road. James could clearly see that for this round, he would have to face 5 opponents. That wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that they all had guns in their hands. "Major player, bring it on," yelled one man. "We'll fight to the death," yelled another. A man wearing a grizzly bear helmet waved the gun in his hand and shouted, "Go, go, go!" They all started up their motorcycles. The game had begun. And James thought, "You're not messing around." James flipped his headlights back on. He made a quick decision. Rather than take the main road, he'd go through the dense forest.